am will Got it. Yeah, they're testing me now. With that in mind, as always, I take great pride in just as good historians should, just presenting you both sides of the issue. So we're going to be looking at it from an Israeli perspective, from a Palestinian perspective, and from a British perspective. I am very much an Anglophile. I do love British history, but the Brits are very much to blame in this conflict, and we'll be discussing why. So, a couple of common myths and misconceptions about the current conflict as it stands. So, the current conflict, you may have heard, goes back thousands of years, and it's not entirely the case. Obviously, there has been bad blood between people of Palestinian ethnicity and the Hebrews, but this current conflict is very much more about land, as I'm sure all of you are familiar with, and less about the ideological. We will discuss how this is kind of an Islam versus Judaism overarching problem, but for the most part, this conflict is just over 100 years old, this current conflict. It has its roots around 1917, the middle of World War I to the end of World War I. So we're talking 105, 106 years ago. This is the current Palestinian-Israeli conflict that we're dealing with. Yeah, and especially over the past couple decades. If we go back to the first Intifada in the 1980s, which we'll discuss, this is very much about land. Okay, so I tried to squeeze it drives my students crazy because I always keep them to the very last second because I'm trying to squeeze as much history into this as possible. I want to give you as much info as possible without putting you to sleep. So we're going to cover about 400 years of history in about 2 minutes. Stay with me. So we have the Ottoman Empire. Just by a show of hands, how many of you have heard of the Ottoman Empire before? Okay, we're good. We're good. We got. So, the Ottomans ruled over the area known as Palestine from about 1566 to 1919. So, to kind of give you a sense of what's going on in the world, 1566, we're still in the Renaissance in Italy, the High Renaissance, and 1919 is the end of World War I with the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. The Ottomans were a losing member of World War I, and as such, to the victor go the spoils. They lose all of their land post-World War I. As an additional consequence, we'll discuss this momentarily, the British Empire is the one who takes over most of the Ottomans' land. Obviously, the United States plays a big role in World War I. We turn the tide when we come in 1917. But very much this was a British and French versus German for the first 3.5 years of this conflict. So Great Britain, as one of the main players and one of the individuals one of the states who kind of suffered the most in World War I, they got a lot of the treasure at the end. So here we have a map of, and I'll for those of you who are not on Zoom here I'll move this so you can see it. This is a map of Ottoman territory in 1566. So again, this is High Renaissance. They have all of North Africa, the coastline. This is Morocco, Algeria, Libya, and of course Egypt. They have the coastline of modern-day Saudi Arabia, a little bit of Lebanon, a little bit of Jordan. The Ottomans themselves are based in modern-day Turkey, and they have they have all of the Balkans. So Albania, Macedonia, Greece, a little bit of Slovenia and Slovakia, and a little bit of Ukraine up here. If we flash forward to 1882, now for those of you who know your history, you may know 1882 is the beginning of the scramble for Africa. This is when the European powers kind of divvied up Africa without telling the people of Africa and started colonizing Africa. We could see that the Ottoman Empire their territory has shrunk. They control a little bit of Libya, Still Saudi Arabia and Turkey. They've lost a lot of the Balkans. And we're going to come back to this in a moment. At the start of World War I, okay, so this is 1914, 109 years ago. This is the territory that they controlled. Basically modern-day Turkey, stretching down Saudi Arabia, this coast of Saudi Arabia, and stretching down to the Strait of Hormuz, right? Not quite the Strait of Hormuz, but the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. By the end of World War I, just 5 years later, this is what the Ottoman territory had been reduced to. Now, I'm sure you're thinking, what the hell does this have to do with the current conflict? Bear with me, we will be getting there. But the reason I bring this up is, very surprisingly, now the Ottomans committed a horrible genocide up in Armenia. So we're not going to give the Ottomans a full pass here. But when it came to Palestine, it was a relatively peaceful and successful area. We could see the breakdown of the population, predominantly Muslim actually, about 87% Muslim, 10% Christian, 3% Jewish. But the religious populations in Jerusalem, back in 1887, roughly equal. So 33, 33, 33, you can consider it. So, as I had mentioned, relatively peaceful in pre-British rule. And there's a fantastic example of this, a very famous musician named Wasif Jaharia. I put the pronunciation of his name in parentheses, more so for me. This was not insulting to you. This is so I could remember how to pronounce it. Jaharia. He grows up in Jerusalem in the first decade of the 20th century, so the 1910s. And here is Jaharia on the right. Very handsome-looking fellow. Very famous musician during this time period. And the reason I put this in here is I found this fascinating, because we all know that the headbutting that goes on now. Take a look at what Jaharia's life was like in 1910. He was a Christian, but he learned the Quran in school, and he observed both Passover and Eid, the Muslim celebration, with his Jewish and Muslim neighbors respectively. Additionally, I have a direct quote here, Jaharia's education demonstrates the fluidity of boundaries in the Ottoman Empire during his youth, so during the turn of the 20th century. In the contemporary world, people's identities and social and political roles are relatively fixed. Right today, you're either a Jew or an Arab, you're either Jewish or Muslim, but then it's kind of a mixed bag. Boundaries separating the lives of Christian or Jews from Muslims were more fluid, as were urban social boundaries. So this man right here, he grows up Christian, but he's celebrating the Jewish high holidays with his Jewish neighbors. He's celebrating the Muslim high holidays with his Muslim neighbors. And he attends essentially a Christian elementary middle school. He attends kind of a Muslim high school where he's taught the Quran. And later on, he is taught English. And he learns the Torah as well. So this is such a beautiful example of how, now, again, it's not all sunshine and rainbows. We know that religious conflict has always existed, and not to be negative, but most likely will continue to exist. But I liked this snapshot because it proved that before the British get involved here, this is a relatively peaceful time in Palestine. Even World War II. World War II, as crazy as it was exceptionally peaceful in Palestine during World War II, comparatively and ironically. So, and I'm sure a lot of this will be repetitive for you, but let me get through one or two more slides and then I'll open it up for questions. So we have our friend Theodor Herzl here. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of Herzl. He is the father of modern Zionism, political Zionism, right? This thrust for a Jewish home state. The official dictionary definition, it changes actually. A movement for originally the reestablishment of a Jewish homeland, and now the development and protection of a Jewish nation. So Zionism as a term has the definition has grown and altered over time. Now, I put this up because I thought it was interesting. Theodor Herzl is from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was a mess, and we could see because look at how many different ethnicities are within this one empire. All right, we have the Czech Republic, now known as Czechia. We have Austria, parts of Slovenia, next to Italy, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, right, capital of Belgrade here, Romania, parts of Moldova, Slovakia, all of Hungary, part of Ukraine. So Herzl is growing up at a time period when all of these individual nations are jockeying for their own state. So he's very encouraged by this. He's like, okay, if we can jockey for our own states in Europe, maybe we can do it in the homeland as well. The key point that I want to bring up here, and maybe we'll do one more slide after this, and then I'll open it up for questions. Most Zionists at this point in time are secular. They are secular Jews who are immigrating for a specific state. Right? And I like the way this is phrased. They are emigrating Europe for a state for Jews rather than a Jewish state. And the reason I put this in here is just again to emphasize that this current conflict that we're experiencing here in the world is not really a religious conflict at its most basic. And I'm going to get into that a little further. So, Great Britain intervenes. Right, this is how most history books start, by the way, if you ever. In 1917, this is a bold move, by the way. I always get a kick out of this because the war is not won by any stretch of the imagination. They are quite literally in the middle of World War I, and they kind of have the gall, the very, very stereotypical British gall. They want to try and swing the war in their favor, and they're going to do anything to do this. Right off the bat, they want to gain the support of the Jews, the European Jews. A lot of very powerful families, most noticeably the Rothschilds in England. I'm sure you've heard of the Rothschilds. And this individual down here, Lord Balfour, who looks a little like John Cleese to me, but maybe it's just the British. Lord Balfour issues a declaration, and it's handed personally to Lord Rothschild, who was one of the leading Jews in Great Britain at this time period. Something called the Balfour Declaration. We have Lord Walter Rothschild, a British banker, zoologist, former soldier. He did it all, politician. But most importantly, he's a Zionist leader. And Balfour down here wants the Jews' support. We're in the middle of the war. Britain needs all the support they can get, and the Jews are the first support that they want to get. So I included here the actual Balfour Declaration. I know it's very tiny for those of you on Zoom, and even tinier for those of you here in person. I'm going to read it to you very briefly because I think it's worth repeating in its entirety. Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the British Cabinet. His Majesty's government view from favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing, this is very classic British, over-promising, nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. So essentially what Lord Balfour is promising here is we're going to establish a Jewish state for Jews in Palestine, but we're not going to bother the people who are already there. So it's not going to work out well. Not going to work out well. This is a classic case, and all kidding aside, it's a very heavy topic, so please don't think me irreverent. I'm just trying to lighten it a little bit here. This is, throughout history, all kidding aside, a very classic case of British overpromising. this is a technique and a tactic used by the British everywhere they conquered, everywhere they went. They would promise everything to every single different group, and then when it was time to pay the piper, they were just like, oh, we, just kidding, right? Just kind of kidding here. And we're going to see an example of that momentarily. It gets even crazier, but let me pause momentarily for a few minutes. Does anybody have any questions? I will open up our Zoom window, and all I ask is if you please just raise your hand. I want to just ensure that we have everybody represented. So we have a question here in person first. So let me take this question as well, and I will repeat it for the folks here on Zoom. Yeah. Yes. That is a fantastic question. And the lady here, my apologies, ma'am, your name? Christine. Christine here asked a very fantastic question. The time period in which we're talking, what officially constituted Palestine? Because I have thrown the word Palestine out very loosely. The answer to that is nobody knew. The Ottomans didn't know, the British didn't know, because as you had mentioned, Christine had mentioned how the southern part of Jordan was considered part of Palestine, which we now understand not to be the case. So depending on what map you look at, it sounds like a cop-out answer, I promise you it's not. Depending on what map you look at and what time period, the definition of Palestine changes just as much as the borders of a Palestine change. So this is one of the reasons that plays into why things are so horrible now. So I wish I had a specific reason for that, but poor record keeping. Exactly. Exactly. And this map, as Christina said, is from the National Geographic. Even back then, as trustworthy as Nat Geo is, it's chaos back then, absolute chaos. I have one more question here in person, and then I will go to Zoom. Yes. It's a great question. The question here was, at the time that this declaration is made, 1917, it's still under Ottoman rule, because the Ottomans have not lost World War I yet. So this is very much promising. It would be like, and if it doesn't make sense, that's kind of a good thing, because it doesn't actually make sense. It would kind of be like if if Christine was to move to a nice mansion in a nice penthouse in Manhattan. I know she doesn't want that, but let's pretend for a second that she does. It would kind of be like me saying, all right, Christine's house is mine, and I'm just gonna, maybe I'll start altering it now. And Christine's like, I haven't left yet. I still live here. I may not move to this penthouse, because if you saw her guttural reaction on folks on Zoom, you would realize that this is not what she wants. But I'm promising something that does not belong to me yet. And the next couple slides are going to really hammer this home, because if you think it's crazy now, just wait to see how much more the British have effed this up. Very good. Let me just go to Zoom. Is there anyone on Zoom who has a specific question? And again, there will be time the rest of the presentation, but for the time being, any questions? Okay, excellent. Well, in the interest of time, let me continue back on our presentation, and we, of course, will have time for questions again. So if you still have a question, do not worry. We will get to you, I promise. Okay, fantastic. So the British just promised Palestine, again, this amorphous Palestine that we really don't know the boundaries of, to the Israelis. Excuse me, not to the Israelis, to the Jews of Europe, the Zionists of Europe. A year earlier, 1916, we have something called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And it was Sir Mark Sykes, who I think looks about as stereotypically British as you can get. That is just, when you think of a Brit, that is what you think of, that debonair, handsome mustache right there. And Francois-Georges Picot, the French diplomat. Britain and France would divide the Arab territories, and Britain would just keep Palestine for themselves. Okay, so now we're in 1916. This is even earlier, and the war is there is even less guarantee that the British are going to win this war, and they are already making promises. This is what it would look like, according to the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Armenia would go to the Russians. This area, which is like Turkey, parts of Jordan, it's a mess, and Syria, would go to the French. Palestine would remain under British rule. Not a free Israeli state, but a British rule. Iraq would be an Arab state, but not an independent Arab state, a Arab state under British protection, whereas the area of modern-day Kuwait, the Persian Gulf right here, would be under just British rule. All right, if you think things are already crazy enough, let's take a look at the next slide to see how how things have gotten even crazier. The same exact year, we have what's called the McMahon-Hussein correspondence. We have Sir Henry McMahon, who is the High Commissioner to Egypt, engaged in separate agreements with Sharif Hussein, who is the ruler of Mecca. Mecca being, right, the holy city of Muslims in Saudi Arabia. I'm sorry. As a historian, you just have to laugh because it's a so much of history is a Shakespearean tragedy, where, in hindsight, it's just so easily avoidable. Romeo and Juliet, just check her pulse. See if she's dead first before killing herself, right? It's so easily fixed. McMahon promises Hussein an independent Arab state, including Palestine, and the recognition of Arab independence if he leads an Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire. And I won't read the specific correspondence here. I know it's a little hazy, a little blurry, but don't worry if you can't read it. It's exactly what I just mentioned. So simultaneously, in the span of a year and a half, they have made an agreement with the French to divvy up the land and keep Palestine. They have promised the Zionists that they will give Palestine to them, and they have promised the Arabs that they will give Palestine to them. Okay? And Hussein, very diligently, because he also wants independence for his people, leads this revolt against the Ottomans, and it succeeds. So it only makes sense that after the war, Sharif Hussein goes to the British and says, okay, I did what you wanted me to do. We lost a lot of people here. May we have our state, please? It's not going to work well. So after World War I, British come out on top. What are we going to do at this point? We've made a lot of promises that we can't keep. The British established a colony in Palestine with the idea that they would rule until the Palestinians were able to govern themselves. Now, based on what we just learned, the Palestinians in 1919 said, we are ready to govern ourselves. You just promised us this 3 years earlier. We're ready. Like, you can leave. You, right? Kind of like if you have a child who's kind of like babysitting age, and they're like, well, you could trust me. Like, we're fine. I'm an adult now. But the Palestinians were kind of promised this, or excuse me, the Arabs. The British instituted, and this also is where things go awry. Because we had talked about Jahariya and how wonderfully peaceful Palestine was. The British come in and they immediately institute separate institutions. They separate the Jews, they separate the Christians, they separate the Muslims. So instead of everyone living together in peace, The Jews are put in one place, the Muslims are put in one place, the Christians are put in one place. And what happens when you do this? Chaos. It causes a wedge. This was a classic technique, again, used by the British. Every place they conquered, India, Egypt, the United States, what would become the United States. This is a divide and conquer technique. I promise Christine one thing, I promise Allison another thing, I promise Larry another thing. So all three of them think that I'm their friend, when in reality, all I'm doing is pitting them against one another while I take all the money. Right? Classic British technique in history. Not just the British, I don't mean to just dump on the British. Every colonizing power in history uses this technique. To the British's credit, though, they do try and honor the Balfour Declaration. All right, they didn't have to do this, but they do. They do try and honor it, which is noble. We'll give them credit for that. They helped facilitate the movement from Jews from Europe to Palestine, and from 1920, so this is a year after the end of World War I, to 1939, this is right when Adolf Hitler invades Poland, September 1st, 320,000 Jews move to this, again, Christine, amorphous area of Palestine that we're still not sure where the boundaries are. So remember, if you remember from the earlier slide, Jews in 1887 represented 3% of the population. By the 1930s, they represent 30%, which, again, wouldn't be a problem if the British hadn't separated everyone. All right, and here's a fantastic ship, the Haganah ship, transporting people to Palestine. Now, the Israeli settlers focused on purchasing land from absentee non-Palestinian landowners and then evicting Palestinian farmers who were living and working there. This seems kind of brutal by settlers, but it makes financial sense. And again, hindsight is so clear. Hindsight's 20/20, right? But you're a brand new settler. You're a Jew who's moving to the area of Palestine. You have this big tract of land that you want to farm. The Arab owner is nowhere to be found, so it's kind of up in the air. You purchase this legally, and then the Palestinians who are kind of squatting on that land, you kick out. So on the surface, it makes sense. But the Palestinians obviously are not going to be too happy about this because, again, to them, right, we have to look at both sides here. The British promised them their own state. They promised a free Arab state if Hussein led that revolt against the Ottomans, which he did. So the Palestinians are sitting back saying, you're honoring the Balfour Declaration. What about us? We're getting kicked off our land. So keep this in mind now. The hope was to establish a more secure community. Right, this is very much Israel's intention with building the wall in the West Bank. Right? The goal is security, but to people who are not Jews or not Israelis, view this as a threat. Okay. Yes, let me pause once more for questions. I have a question here. Let's start with a question here, and then I will repeat it for you folks on Zoom. Statement, go ahead. Yes, and we're going to talk about that momentarily because this heightens during World War II. At the very moment that Jews need to leave as much as possible, in the waning years of the 1930s, and I will repeat this question, in the waning years of the 1930s, the Brits do severely limit Jewish emigration. And the question here was, or the statement rather was, her father was a Zionist who emigrated from Europe to Palestine in 1933, became a police officer for the British, and the British severely curtailed movement. This is true. We will talk about this. Very good. Actually, next slide. I have another question here. I will go to you folks on Zoom. Good question. The question here is, why did the British want to hold on to Palestine as opposed to holding on to the Kuwaiti oil fields or other more quote-unquote desirable lands? The straight, clear-cut answer here is it's greed. It's just greed. You have land that costs you nothing, and you're getting taxes from it, from the people there. Why give it up? And it seems flippant and it seems stupid, but that's what colonization was. It's pure greed, nothing more. I know we have a few more questions here. Let me just see if any folks here want on Zoom, but then I will, of course, answer. Anyone here on Zoom have a question so far? All right, the folks on Zoom are either understanding this completely or they are bored. Hopefully not the latter. I had another question here. Yes, sir. Yes. Yep, yep. Yep. Great question. I too have contributed to the JNF, the Jewish National Fund. So the question by this gentleman here was, when he was a kid, he would donate money to the JNF, the Jewish National Fund, to buy land in Israel. Then the question is very simply, what land was this buying? The short answer to this, the JNF mostly operated in the West Bank. Most of the land purchased was in the West Bank. And this is, again, where we have this trouble. Because, right, we're donating this money for the Israelis to purchase this land. They are purchasing this land legally. This is a legal purchase. However, and this is how we're viewing this, right? I know not all of us are Jews in this room, but and not all of us are Israel supporters in this room. But for the moment, this is how we're viewing this. Let's take a moment to look at how the Palestinians are viewing this now. They're looking at this as just more of a betrayal by the British. That, yes, the Israelis are purchasing this land legally, technically, but at the same time, if you're a Palestinian, you're going to argue, you're going to hearken back to that 1916 promise. We led this revolt. We were part of the larger Arab revolt that started in Saudi Arabia against the Ottomans. We were promised the land. The British honored it for the Jews. Why is our land diminishing? Now, I'm not saying that that is a correct point of view or a wrong point of view. I'm simply saying that's where the Palestinians are coming from this. But to answer your question definitively, most of that is the West Bank. Yes. One more question, and then I'll get along just so we have time to finish. Yes, ma'am. That is the word. Yes, ma'am. The question was, can I better define the term institutions? I had mentioned how the British set up different quote-unquote institutions for the Jews, the Muslims, and the Christians. This is nothing more than infrastructure. So separate schools, separate places of worship, stuff along those lines. Whereas back then in the 1880s, sometimes they would actually share places of worship, right? Because as we know, at least growing up as a Jew, services for me were Friday night. Whereas I know if you're Christian, Sunday morning, and I know you can go other times than this, but since the holy days or the days that you go to temple or church or mosque are not necessarily aligned, we had a lot of people sharing institutions back in the 1880s. The schools were the key, and that is very important because, again, just like Jahariya, who got this worldly view, right, got this understanding, that's no longer. You have this divide now. If you're Jewish, you're studying at a Jewish school. You're studying the Torah, and you're not exposed to anything else. If you're Muslim, you're studying the Quran, and you're at a Muslim school, you're not studying anything else. Same for the Christians. And the more you drive that wedge in, the more distrust you're going to have of the population. It's a very good question. So I'm sure there are more. Let me just continue on. I want to make sure that we get through, and I promise, we will have time at the end. So the interwar years, this is going to harken back to the question that you had just asked regarding the limiting of Jewish immigrants. Palestinians began viewing themselves as a Palestinian nation in the 1930s. And this growing sense of nationalism erupts in 1936 when the Palestinians revolt against the British rule. The revolt is brutally repressed by the British with the help of Jewish militias. Now, this is interesting. The Jewish militias played very little role in this. But the British are really, again, the ones to blame. But if you were living day to day in the area of Palestine, and you're seeing these Israelis, not yet, well, not quite yet, there's another decade to go, but these Jews who helped the British, you're going to view them as the enemy. Let's just keep that in mind. This resulted in the British limiting Jewish immigration to Palestine. Well, that would help. I'm very sorry about that. I got too excited. I'm again, hopefully the folks on Zoom could see that. Let me, all right, let's put that back up. And thank you, Allison. My apologies. Yeah, so just a couple of pictures here, but I'm very happy that Allison had mentioned that. My fault there. So the British recognize this and then make another poor decision. They're saying, all right, the Palestinians are very upset with the Jews, not looking inwardly, right? Not looking towards themselves as the people who brutally suppressed this revolt. So they limit Jewish immigration. This angered everyone. No one is happy now. The Zionists were angry over the limiting of immigration, just as was mentioned, at a time when Jews desperately needed to leave Europe. Remember, Kristallnacht is years before the start of World War II, my apologies. Jews are being targeted years before, 1934, 1935, 1936. So the Jews are furious, and they have a right to be furious. The Palestinians are angry because, once again, they were given this promise for a state. And the British had mentioned, remember, give us 10 years, when you're ready to rule yourself. It's 1936 now. 17 years have passed. And the Palestinians are looking around saying, okay, when are you leaving, right? Okay. Post-World War II. So this is the concluding slides to really catch us up to today. World War II, as I had mentioned, was ironically a very peaceful time in Palestine. Yes, there was fighting in the Middle East. Most of the fighting that we consider of this time period was the African front, Erwin Rommel, Bernard Montgomery, occurring in Egypt, occurring in Libya, occurring in Algeria. A few battles are occurring in Saudi Arabia, but for the most part, this area, ironically, is spared of a lot of violence. After World War II, this is such a cop-out, and I'm sorry if anybody's from Great Britain. I do love the British. I am an Anglophile, but my goodness, this is... After World War II, the British step back and they look at this and they're like, you know what? We messed up, but we don't want to deal with this anymore. So they kind of just foist this entire problem onto the newly created United Nations. And then they leave. Okay, so they made all these promises and they're just going to leave. The UN takes over in 1947, and they create something called the Partition Plan. Territories roughly equal in size, but the territories look like a jigsaw puzzle. Again, hindsight is 20/20, but in what universe was this going to work? No universe. This was another poor job, right? UN does do some good work, but not here. This was bad. This led then to the 1948 Arab-Israeli war, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with. I'll very briefly go over it. Israel won, right, this miracle victory against basically the entire Middle East, and they end up occupying a third more land than they would have under the UN plan. Jordan is occupied, the West Bank is occupied, and the old city of Jerusalem is occupied. Whereas Egypt continues to control the Gaza Strip. And again, Gaza, of course, is where our current conflict is. Over 700,000 Palestinians flee and become refugees in neighboring Jordan, over here, Lebanon, up here, and Egypt, over here. Now, to the Israelis, this is fantastic. And I'm sure for your father, right, this was a tremendous moment of triumph. Independence. This is independence, 1948. after all of these years, from Herzl, the past 60 years, the Jews have finally have a Jewish state. Wow, here it is. This is fantastic from an Israeli perspective, from a Jewish perspective. From the Palestinian perspective, this is I'm struggling to come up with a historical parable off the top of my head, but this is what they refer to as the Nabka, or the catastrophe. This is where they become officially stateless. Whereas before this, there was really no definitive borders, right? It's amorphous. Jews are living there, Arabs are living there. 1948 definitively places a Jewish state, which is a good thing. But for the Palestinians, it's a bad thing. Flash forward to the 60s, the Six-Day War. Very appropriately lasted 6 days. Contrary to the 100 Years' War, by the way. My students are always 100 Years' War lasted 116 years. Someone messed up there. Israel, remember, Six-Day War is another incredible victory for Israel. They gained control over the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the entire Sinai Peninsula, and the Golan Heights. So this is a picture of this, right? So here are the Golan Heights in modern-day Syria, the Gaza Strip, again, where our current conflict is, the West Bank, and the entire Sinai Peninsula. Now, Israel, let's look at this from an Israeli perspective. This is about defense, all right? And they don't really care about the Sinai Peninsula. So they're going to give this right back to Egypt. The UN offers a solution. Israel would withdraw from the territory conquered during the war, and all participants, this is important, all participants would recognize the right for both a Palestinian and an Israeli state to exist. Now, both sides get screwed again, because we know that a lot of Arab nations, Iraq, Iran, Yemen, Oman, do not recognize that Israel even exists. They violated this. On the other end, Palestinian state did not happen either. So the Israelis are upset because they're still not recognized, and the Palestinians are upset because they still don't have a state. I'll pass through that for now. Tensions, I know we're wrapping up. I promise to leave at least 5 minutes here. Please bear with me. Tensions begin to continue to rise. We have the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. They occasionally acted peacefully and nonviolently in the beginning, but they very quickly became known for using guerrilla tactics and targeting civilians. At the same time, Israeli settlers began setting up camp, quite literally, in historically Palestinian areas. So again, even though Palestine doesn't have a state, these were specific areas where just the majority of Palestinians had lived. So to a Palestinian perspective, this is adding even further insult to injury. Not only, I'll talk as a Palestinian for a moment, not only do we not have a state, but now the Israelis are taking the few lands that we have. Okay, and I'm going to talk as an Israeli. From an Israeli perspective, this is an Israeli state. Palestine does not have a state. This is not their country. We can see here are our settlements. This is where a lot of that money went to buy land in the West Bank. Now, this is technically illegal under international law because international law recognizes Palestine. Israel does not. Israel counters by arguing that their actions were not illegal because, once again, Palestine is not officially a state. Okay. Moving forward, we have the Intifada of the 1980s. Started with boycotts and protests, but once again quickly devolved into violence. This is where Hamas was founded. We all know Hamas. Hamas gains popularity, and this is why Hamas is still popular amongst Palestinians. Right? Hamas, even though they are a terrorist organization, and they are listed as a terrorist organization by most of the Western world. If you go on the CIA's website, they are listed as a terrorist organization. However, what confuses things is that Hamas is the leading political party in Palestine. They hold the majority of assembly seats. So they're simultaneously a terrorist organization, but they're also the leading government. So how do you fight this? Hamas does a lot of good things for the people in the 80s, and this is where they get their original support. They set up schools. They set up social welfare programs for people who are struggling. This endears them to the population. However, they are a terrorist organization, and they conduct their first suicide bombing in 1993. Wrapping up here, we have the Oslo Accords and the Clinton talks. This I will very briefly go over because I know that all of you lived through this and probably remember it very well. On the left we have Yitzhak Rabin, and on the right we have Yasser Arafat. Israel accepted the PLO as the representative of the Palestinians, and the PLO renounced terrorism and recognized Israel's right to exist in peace. Cool, right? Can we stick to this, please? Can everyone behave themselves, please? This is not going to happen. Immediately collapsed. In November of 95, Rabin is assassinated, not by a Palestinian, not by an Egyptian, not even by a Muslim. He is assassinated by a Jewish Israeli who was upset about this move. Rabin's murder was followed by a string of terrorist attacks by Hamas. So hopefully you're getting you're recognizing a pattern here that I am very much attacking both the Israelis and the Palestinians here, as well as the British. That's my pleasure as a historian. I just get to attack people. But ethically, I'm not giving you any false information here. This led to, drum roll please, the election of Netanyahu, who we discussed either last month or 2 months ago. And what do we know about Netanyahu? He has a very far-right, very nationalist regime, and they are dead set, and he's essentially been in power on and off since the 90s, dead set against a Palestinian state, dead set against any kind of cooperation when it comes to that specific issue at all, specifically focusing on Israeli defense, which I'm not saying is a bad thing, and specifically focusing on extending these settlements. All right, I know we're winding down. Let me just, please bear with me. I'll get through this, then we'll open it up. We have Sharon. He leads those 1,000 armed guards to the Temple Mount in 2000. This is the third holiest site to Muslims, also the holiest sites to Jews. This led to the much more violent Second Intifada. 1,000 Israelis are killed, 3,000 Palestinians are killed. 2002, Israel begins constructing the wall in the West Bank. Very interestingly enough, regardless of how you feel about him, former President Trump, with his drive to build that wall in Mexico, there is a lot of Trump-related graffiti, pro and con, on this wall for the same reason. Just thought that was interesting. However, instead of following the borders established after the Six-Day War in 1967, Israel expanded significantly into the West Bank in order to encompass additional Israeli settlements. Now, let's look at this from both sides again. To the Israelis, these are Israeli citizens. We have to protect them. We have to get this in the wall. Them in the wall, right? To the Palestinians, this is not your land, right? This was established as, even though we don't have a state, this was established as, we were promised some sort of land, and you are even further encroaching by building this wall. In 2005, Hamas wins the majority of parliamentary seats, and they have held this majority since, for the past 18 years. Over the past 2 decades, Palestinians have instigated by launching missiles into Israel. This is their fault. Israel has responded with, as a military historian, this is not me being biased, but as a military historian, sometimes too much force, and both sides are in trouble. So, I will open it up now to questions, thoughts, but one final thought before I get to this, and I know we are over. I appreciate, again, my poor dog got sick in his crate this morning, and I had to clean it up, which is why I was late. So, thank you. So, again, hopefully this was able to provide you with a little background. And I had mentioned ahead of time, right? I am Jewish. I was raised Jewish. I have 121 relatives in Israel, 6 in the Israeli Defense Force, 2 are currently on the ground fighting for Israel at the Gaza Strip. However, as a good historian, I put these feelings to the side and I present both sides to you. All right? The Palestinians have a very legitimate argument because of what they were denied by the British in the 1900s. And if we, I know, just bring this up. To Palestinians, the Palestinian people have been denied a state not just since the formation of Israel, but also for decades before that. And now they live under what amounts to a military occupation. This is true, right? Whether you agree with the Palestinians or not, this is the reality. And I will, in defense of one aspect of the Palestinians, I want you to think of the Palestinian people here. Not the terrorists, not Hamas, just the average run-of-the-mill people. One of the biggest arguments that I've seen made against the Palestinians is, if Hamas is so horrible and terroristic, why don't the people rise up and overthrow them? Very easy on paper, very difficult to do. Right? Hamas is both simultaneously the military, the government, and a terrorist organization. And if you are Joe Schmo living on the street in Palestine, if you are a pregnant woman, if you are a child, you don't have a lot of areas to turn. So this is true. At the same time, the Jewish people need a homeland, which the United Nations guaranteed them too, to consolidate and increase their territory via military conflict, which is not unique to them. I don't mean to pick on Israel because everyone has done this in history. Additionally, there are still Arab states, as of November 13th, 2023, who do not recognize Israel as having a right to exist whatsoever. This is wrong. This is also wrong. But what I wanted to try and get across to all of you today is it's very easy to take sides in this conflict. And all I ask is maybe take a step back. And again, I'll put myself on the line here. I'm about as invested in this conflict as I possibly could be. I have family members on the front lines right now. But I encourage all of you, even with that in mind, and I know all of you have family in Israel as well, or most of you do. We have to understand, in order for there eventually to be peace, we have to understand where both sides are coming from. We have to understand what they're arguing for. Now, is everything the Palestinians are arguing for right and good? No. Is everything the Israelis are arguing for right and good? No. But some kind of middle ground something needs to be done for this to end. And the only way we do this is being as unbiased as possible and recognizing where both sides stand. Doesn't mean you have to agree with either side, but just recognizing this. And that's really what I tried to get across today. So I know we are already over. Please blame Hank, my dog. But Allison, if we may have 5 minutes, is that okay? All right. I'm sure we will have questions on Zoom, but we have a few here. Let's start here, and I will repeat it for you. Sally. Thank you, Sally. Very good question. So Sally, thank you very much for your kind words. I appreciate it. Sally had talked about the Palestinians leaving post-independence, 1948. They were, the war was so destructive that they didn't have anywhere to live. So they do become refugees in the neighboring countries. They are essentially forced to leave, if that answers your question. And I'm sorry, Sally, was there a second part to there was, what else did you have for me? Maybe that was it. My apologies, Sally. I got too. Did that answer your question? Okay. Right. Yes, they did have to leave. They had no homes. There was what you see now, the bombing, for instance, in Gaza. That went so widespread during the 48 war that they literally had nowhere to leave and had to seek help elsewhere. Very good. One more question here in person, then I will go to Zoom. Yes, sir? Yes. Ben Gurion, yeah. Uh, yeah, and I will repeat this, I promise. Go ahead. Hmm. Hmm. Exactly. And yeah. Yes. Yes. Yeah, and just in the interest of time, let me just continue because you made some really good points. You had mentioned David Ben Gurion, who again, a hero of independence in '48. He says in after the Six-Day War, give everything back but Jerusalem. Now, may have been a little bit extreme, may not have been. As you had also mentioned, the Arab nations hold this conference in '67, and this is why, again, unbiasedly, you can really put a lot of the current blame based on the religion aspect. I haven't touched upon religion whatsoever, but this kind of militaristic Islamism, this terroristic Islamism, that Israel does not exist, we do not accept Israel, and no negotiations. Israel was willing to come to the peace table. There have been times where the Palestinians have been willing to come to the peace table. I would argue not as much as the Israelis in this case, but yes, there have been opportunities in the past for peace. Tons and tons and tons of opportunities, and one side or the other has either backed out or violated this. Now, I know you mentioned so many good things. Let me try and just get one more question on Zoom. Zoom, you've been so kind. Does anybody have any questions that I can assist with? I can do my best. Carol types, I question whether any peace can happen unless both sides go to the negotiation table, it appears. And Carol, I think this is a fantastic point. Thank you very much for making it. And I'd very briefly like to just 60 seconds, if you'll allow me. This is my opinion, strictly my opinion. You know where I stand on this issue, but this is from a historian's perspective. I'm putting all of my preconceived bias aside. I am looking at this just through the lens of a historian. I think there's a very simple solution to this problem. And simple, I mean on paper. Putting it in practice will not happen. But we know that at any negotiations, both sides have to give up a lot, right? This would be my proposal if I was in charge of a peace organization. And I say this, again, as a historian and seeing how things have developed in the past. If I am Israel, I am giving up land for an independent Palestinian state. Now, I know that angers some of you in here. However, my argument here would be the Palestinians will not stop fighting until they have some kind of state. Right. But that's a big concession for the Israelis. So what are the Israelis getting in turn? My counter-argument would be for the Israelis, they get two things. They get recognition by every Arab state that they are allowed to exist and that they should be left in peace. Now, roll your eyes. important. Now, on paper, this makes sense, right? Everyone gets what they want. Everyone lives in peace. The Palestinians are not going to stop fighting until they have the land, and the Israelis are not going to stop fighting until they're guaranteed protection from their neighbors who want to destroy them. This solves two major issues right here. I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm not saying it's perfect. But something has to give. Both sides will have to give up a lot for a peace treaty to happen. And I apologize. I know we're very much out of time. Thank you very much, everyone. I appreciate it. I hope you're able to take something from this. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody online. I think we had a great history lesson today.
It was great. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Very informative. Yeah.